And so I will begin the webinar today. The topic, of course, is called Decoding Food Labels, what you need to know before you buy. So we'll be talking about something that you probably look at maybe every single day, and just to get a little more understanding over what's on the food labels and what's all involved. Now remember, it's the quality of your calories that matters. And so what better time to use this phrase that I use for each presentation, because reading food labels and understanding them can actually help us find what the top quality calories happen to be. So what we're going to cover today is, of course, what's all involved in a food label. What does that mean exactly? I think a lot of us think of nutrition facts, but there's more to it. But speaking of nutrition facts, we'll be going over on a deeper dive into what those are, what they contain, and how to actually interpret that. We'll also look at what those label claims are. If you look at things that say low in, reduced fat, et cetera, there are actually definitions that go behind those phrases. Also, there are some upcoming or proposed label changes that we might see in the future, so I figured we can do a little hot off the presses announcements on some of that. And also, even though it sort of encompasses the entire presentation, hopefully by the end you'll know how to use a food label to make some smart choices for yourself. And of course, if there are any questions that come up at the end of the presentation, your time to shine will be really any time if something pops up, but at the end I leave it open. So feel free to hit the little Q&A button at the bottom left of your screen, and you can choose to be anonymous, or if your name is there, I'll just likely say your name when the question's asked so you know I'm addressing you specifically or that question. So to briefly touch on food labeling in general, because they've been around for a little bit, some basics on them are that food labels are regulated by the FDA and are required to be on most prepared foods. That being said, there are some that are not required. So fish and raw produce, not generally required, that's voluntary. And of course, if there's someone who makes and packages foods, it's a small business, maybe you see them at a farmer's market, it's unlikely you're going to see a food label on their items in full. But for those who do have to use these and are required, there's also required parts of a food label, and that includes the name of the food, the net quantity, so you'll see that weight usually at the bottom of, say, a box, an ingredient list, any potential food allergens, the nutrition facts panel, of course, and also the name and address of the manufacturer, producer, or distributor of the food. And you may also see any nutrient content or health claims. And when those are on there, they must adhere to specific definitions by the FDA. So keep that in mind. That doesn't mean that there aren't some marketing claims that don't really adhere to anything in particular, such as delicious or the words wholesome. That doesn't really have a definition. But some nutrient content claims, health claims, those do have to go abide by specific definitions. So a little more on the history of food labeling changes. The nutrition facts label was actually updated in 2016, and then all manufacturers were required to use the new label by July 1st, 2021. I touched on this during one of my previous presentations, so I thought this was another good time to incorporate it. You can see that the original label on the left of the screen versus the new label, in general, they look similar, but you can see a few changes. And among those were that they were updated with the daily values. The percent daily values on the right of these labels were updated based on some newer established daily values for those nutrients. Also, the vitamins that you see at the bottom, sort of underneath the protein area, that actually changed. So the vitamin A, vitamin C aren't required. They may be listed voluntarily again, but now they've added vitamins D and also potassium. Those have been added because they're the new sort of nutrients of concern. You'll also see that calories from fat was removed, and I think that was a pretty good move on their part because ultimately where the research took us is that it's more about the type of fat, not necessarily the calories you're getting from there. So if you have a lot of saturated fat versus unsaturated fat, you can see that it might be a less desirable choice, regardless of the calories. And added sugars are now required. And so added sugars are any sugar that, of course, is added to the food that didn't exist in the food naturally. I don't believe I touch on this later, so I'll just mention, for example, if you saw milk, just plain 2% milk, you will see a list of sugars. Probably, I believe it says somewhere around 7 grams per cup, 7 or 8 grams. And that is the sugar lactose that exists naturally in milk. They would not have any added sugars in there. But if you have chocolate milk, then you'll see the total sugars being including the lactose, and then underneath that you'll see the added sugars. So to make it sweet. So I just wanted to mention that so you can understand those differences there. So let's dive into the nutrition facts label as we see it currently. On the right-hand screen here, and almost all of the images that I'm using, I got from the FDA websites that talk about nutrition labeling in case you ever want to see on those. But they break it down here very nicely. So first you have the top here with serving information. It talks about the servings per container. So 8 servings per container, and what the serving size is. And the serving size was something that's updated because serving size now is based on what somebody might typically eat or drink. However, that doesn't mean it's a recommended amount. So if something is a 2/3 of a cup and you only want to eat 1/3 of a cup, that is okay. It's just everything that's calculated below here is calculated for what this 2/3 of a cup is. So you may have to multiply or divide based on how much of a serving, what your serving size is compared to this. Then, of course, next in very large, bold print now, we have the calorie information. So the total number of calories per serving or per this serving size. Again, so if you had twice as much, then you'd want to double the calories from 230 up to 460. Moving down beyond that, in the yellow here is the nutrients. So as the FDA puts it, it includes key nutrients that impact your health. And the emphasis is to limit your saturated fat as well as your sodium and added sugars. As far as, oh, and I do talk about added sugars, those that are not naturally occurring in food. And then, of course, things that people like to focus on, of course, is your total dietary fiber, usually protein, and perchance if you are low in iron and finding high iron foods, that may be something you're interested in. So that's how that can help us there. Then the daily values here in purple, and I included the footnote as just an aside because they're saying that these daily values are based on sort of an average 2,000 calorie diet. So just because the percent daily value is listed as such, you may not need quite as much as what's listed. But the daily values are a percentage of a reference amount to reach or also avoid exceeding for the nutrients. And I actually touch on this a bit more in the next slide because daily values, not that they're difficult, but they're sometimes ignored or maybe not fully understood. So a bit more about those percent daily values. So they can show you again how much or little of a food is contributing to the nutrients that are listed on that label. So there are some that you want to limit, and then others you might want to choose more often. So as you can see at the top here, as I'm moving around something on my screen, you can see here that they're reaching out, or they're labeling the nutrients on the left, the saturated fat, sodium, fiber, et cetera. And then this, the daily value, DV here, is the reference amount that we're discussing. So 20 grams of saturated fat would be equal to 100% of the daily value. So ultimately, a goal, if someone is going off of these daily values, is that you want to be less than 20 grams in a day, ideally. Sodium is also one that you want to limit, so you don't want to exceed 100% of your daily value. So maybe the sodium, and here's an example here, if we're talking about sodium and it says that your serving has 850 milligrams, it will say you've reached 37% of the daily value, right? But that means that you have about 63% remaining. You can afford to have some more sodium in your diet throughout the day, maybe, depending on your individual health issues. But that's something to pay attention to because you don't really want to exceed that, especially if you are watching your sodium in your diet. Dietary fiber, they give that limit here. And this is one where it says at least, right? Because fiber is something that's important you want to focus on. And of course, vitamin D, calcium, iron, potassium, they also list here at least. So you can go over these depending, but going less is not what you want to aim for on those nutrients in particular. Now, something else to mention about daily value, and this will call back to this a little bit later in the slides, but with the daily values, you can also interpret a couple other things. So if the nutrient is listed as providing 5% of your daily value or less, then that would be something that's considered low. So if the sodium listed said 5% of your DV, then you know that that would actually be considered a low sodium food. In a similar vein, if something provides 20% of your daily value or more, then that is actually considered a food that is high in that particular nutrient. Moving on, there's also something on food labels that I think is an area that can be a bit confusing, and it's label claims. So there's a few label claims that are available. There are three types that you might see on a food label or a box of food. And there's the health claims, structure function claims, and then nutrient content claims. So we'll touch on the first two here, and then the next one's on the following slide. So health claims describe a relationship between a food substance and a reduced risk of disease or a health-related condition. These are pretty, I would say, strict in terms of the verbiage that has to be used. And so I gave an example. You can see this is probably easily recognizable, the Cheerios box. And so, of course, they list here can help lower cholesterol, but they've got the little asterisk because it needs to have a little more context, a little more qualifying information. So underneath here, you can see 3 grams of soluble fiber daily from whole grain oat foods like Cheerios in a diet low in saturated fat and cholesterol may reduce the risk of heart disease. And Cheerios provides 1 gram of this soluble fiber per serving. And so that's required to be included in there, or they will, get a little bit of a talking to and asked to change their label to reflect the right information that can meet those criteria. There's also the structure function claims, like I mentioned here, and those are a little bit more fluid, so it may describe the role of a nutrient or dietary ingredient that's intended to affect the normal structure or function of the human body. So a good example that was given was calcium builds strong bones. You may see that on maybe something that's a dairy product or milk, and that's what that type of claim is. It does have to be truthful, but it doesn't have to be quite as rigorous as that health claim that you saw above here. And finally, on to the nutrient content claims. And I think this is an area that can be a bit confusing, and it doesn't have to be because these also have some strict requirements, which is nice. But if you're not aware of what it technically means, because it's not typically spelled out anywhere, I wanted to make sure I could list this out so you know what you're looking at if you're reading a food label and you see some of these. So just like I'd mentioned before, when we were talking about daily values, if you see a food product that says high in, rich in, or an excellent source of, then that means the product contains 20% or more of the daily value of that nutrient. So high in fiber, high in calcium, vitamin D, you can see that listed somewhere. However, you might also see something that says good source of. That is a different type of definition. So that means it's meeting 10 to 19% of the daily value of a product. And I'm going to skip this one for a second because reduced is probably one of the more dubious, or not dubious, but one of the more difficult claims and sometimes frustrating for someone like myself. But so going on to free really fast, this does depend on the type of food, but essentially it's usually less than 0.5 grams of, say, sugar or fat, or if it's less than 5 calories or less than 5 milligrams of sodium, then you can count that as being free. Back up to the reduced. So you may see this especially on, say, soups or broths where it might say reduced sodium. And many of us might be compelled to think, oh, wonderful, it's healthy, it's low in sodium. But here's the catch on reduced. Reduced means it's 25% less or more when compared to, say, the original product, typically the original product, or essentially when it's compared to an appropriate reference product. So I wanted to put as examples on the right hand of the screen here. I went with some tomato basil soup and a reduced sodium creamy tomato basil soup. So the original is on the top here, and you can see that the sodium content here is 690 milligrams per serving. So as packaged here, 690 milligrams, we wouldn't consider low sodium, of course, and it's lower than some sodium contents I've seen in soups, but just as a comparison here, here's their reduced sodium similar product. Their sodium is still not low sodium product. It's 480 milligrams, so it is lower, absolutely. But you can see that the reduction isn't a huge amount. And so it's always very important that if you see something that says reduced, very good idea to check the nutrition facts just to see how much more reduced it is, or if it's reduced enough for you or for whatever your health needs might be. Now, moving on to some other food label changes that may be coming up. By the way, I should pause and mention there are some other nutrient content claims that I didn't touch on because they're a little more cut and dry, but if you do have questions about some of those, please let me know. All right, back to this slide. So coming up, of course, food labels, food labeling, they are changing based on research and results. And this one is actually pretty exciting for me because I think our definition of healthy is finally getting translated appropriately to foods that deserve the label and taken away from the foods that didn't really deserve it, in my opinion. So this was very recent. In December of 2024, the FDA has updated what foods can claim healthy on their products. So this is also the first topic here. It is a bit food dependent, but they must meet a minimum amount of at least one food group or a subgroup. So whatever item that wants to claim being healthy is, it must have a certain amount of fruits or veggies, grains, protein, etc. Again, it depends on the type of food, and there was a lengthy chart, but I wouldn't have been able to include this in a way that would have filled one slide. But they do have those requirements. Then the next one is not exceed limits that are established for added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. So those are the ones that we pay attention to, we want to limit. They're saying we don't want to exceed those amounts. And like I said, the amounts determined, they do differ between types of foods. But then looking over here, again, this came from the FDA that are talking about what used to qualify under the healthy claim and now what qualifies with their changes. I think it's really great to look at what used to qualify because I think many of us used to think that yogurts that were high in added sugars, well, it's yogurt, it has to be healthy. But if you look at certain yogurts and it's not been artificially sweetened, it's been sweetened with real sugar. If you look at it, some of them have as much added sugars as ice cream. And so whatever health benefits you might be getting from the yogurt itself kind of is a little bit outdone by all the added sugars that are involved. Also, fortified breakfast cereals that were high in added sugars. We can all think of the multicolored cereals that kids would eat, and we would think, this has to be healthy, but not so much. Similar with fortified white bread that doesn't have any whole grains, fruit snacks that are nothing more than candy, really, if we want to think about it that way, as well as, say, snack bars, so certain granola bars that maybe are chocolate dipped or extra chewy, and then, fruit punch that isn't actual juice. So that's not exactly where we want to go either. So you can see the updates. They're actually going more toward whole, real foods, talking about fresh fruits, frozen, chopped, dried, or canned, although canned, you have to be careful with the sodium content potentially, as well as salmon, trail mix, olive oil, eggs, and then plain low-fat or fat-free yogurt. So I think this is a great change. These aren't the only foods, but those are some good examples. So I think when food companies might want to put healthy on their items, I think we'll be able to feel reassured that we're actually getting a healthier item in general. Now, I did see this was also possibly on the horizon. So in January of this year, the FDA has proposed a new rule that would require what they call front of package nutrition labels on most packaged foods. So this square I have here is, they call it the nutrition info box. And so if you, again, I had that Cheerios on the front of the box, they would have this little nutrition info. It doesn't replace the nutrition label that would be on the side panel, but on the front, you would be able to quickly reference saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. And they even write out here if the food is medium, high, or low in those products. So if you're looking to limit something in particular, you can quickly look at it. You don't have to pick up the box, look to the side. And so this has been proposed. It's not necessarily a guaranteed change, but it might be coming up on the horizon. So we may see that in the future. So if you want to use these food labels to help make your make healthy choices, even though I think when we've talked already, you can sort of see where we're looking to find those healthier alternatives. You want to focus on protein and fiber content. I'm sure that's been drilled into your mind many, many times, but that is very important. And as I've said multiple times during this presentation, you want to limit your sodium, saturated fat, and added sugars. The daily value, like I mentioned, can quickly advise you on if something is high or low in that nutrient. And then I think also using it with other tools, such as the Altman rule, can help you pick healthier options if you're comparing two items that seem pretty similar. And no worries, the Altman rule I will discuss on the following slide, so stay tuned. And then finally, you can check ingredients on the food label, so that ingredients list, just so you're aware, the ingredients are listed in order of weight. So that's why many times if you have a drink, water is oftentimes the number one thing on the list. But yes, that's how it's listed. And ideally, keep it simple. If the ingredient list is almost a novel, that may be a bit overly processed than what you're looking for. It sometimes depends on what ingredients we're talking about, of course. But if you can keep it short and simple, then you're going to most likely be closer to the animal and the plant. So the Altman rule, just to make sure I can clarify this if you weren't already aware, the Altman rule is a way to help guide your choices, especially for more carb-containing foods. If you were looking at cereals, if you were looking at maybe pastas or packages of, well, I'm still referring to cereals and grains, but that would be an area that you could look at these, or bread, for example. And basically what you do is when you look at the food label here, you want to look at the dietary fiber per serving, sugars, doesn't necessarily have to be added sugars, and protein. And so the grams of fiber, you want it to be greater than or equal to 3 grams per serving. And if you add that with the protein, if that's greater than the grams of sugar, then that's a better choice. So I took this image that's on the side here from this article that talks about the Altman rule and whether or not it's a good thing to use versus trying to think about glycemic load and those impacts on blood sugar. And so they even gave a little flow chart here about, is there three or more grams of fiber per serving? If no, it doesn't meet the Altman rule, set it down if you can. If yes, move on. And so they talk about adding it, and then of course, deciding whether or not, yes, the food meets the Altman rule or does not. And I know this is oftentimes used for people who are dealing with blood sugars, but I like to use it for general reference too, just because we know that focusing on fiber for all of us, focusing on fiber is a healthy choice for the majority of the population. So just because you might not be worried about blood sugars doesn't mean that this isn't a really nice guideline to utilize if you can. So putting it together, food labels can definitely help us make more informed decisions on what we choose to eat. So it does give us this tool to be a little more of an informed consumer. So, but it can appear daunting if you've never read one, or if you've just not really had a chance to know what to look for. So hopefully this has cleared that up. Remember that health claims, nutrient content claims, those are strictly regulated. And so knowing what low or reduced actually means can be beneficial for, again, making wiser choices and not necessarily just being influenced by something saying that on the package. And of course, as you've seen, the label updates, additions, they're ongoing. It's a constantly changing area, so you may see new updates in the future. Just like we talked about the healthy claim as well as those info boxes. So don't ever be surprised if you see the packaging change for that reason. And with that, I believe I open this up to questions for the next couple of minutes, if you have any. Again, if you do have any questions, you can type it in that little Q&A spot. You can choose to be anonymous, or you can leave your name. Or if you think of a question after this or don't want to ask it here on the webinar, you can always send those questions to the Premier Weight Loss team. They can get that question sent to me and I will reply just as soon as I can, because I would be happy to answer any questions or concerns that anyone has. So I will wait for just a few minutes. I think we're almost at 12:30, and so I want to make sure I'm respectful of everyone's time here today on this beautiful Wednesday afternoon. I think if you have the chance to enjoy it, you should. But I really appreciate your time today. And again, if you do have questions in the future or any concerns, please reach out to the Premier Weight Loss staff. They will be happy to get you get that question answered by referring to me. And I always welcome questions, but until next time, I hope you have a lovely rest of the day and hope to see you again soon in the next one. Bye.